If you want to understand how real fortunes are built in a collapse, stop looking at the moment the market breaks and start looking at the 18 months before it does. That is where the truth lives. The middle class is taught to think of crashes as weather, unfortunate, unpredictable, something that arrives out of nowhere and punishes everyone equally. The rich do not think that way. They think like buyers standing outside a warehouse before the doors open. They know the sale is coming long before the crowd hears the fire alarm. They do not wait for the panic. They inventory what they want. They decide what they will pay, and they make sure they are the ones holding the only thing that matters when the liquidation begins. Cash control claims on necessity. That is the whole game. Most people imagine wealth is built by courage in the moment. It is not. It is built by structure before the moment. The crash itself is only the transfer ceremony. The real work was done before the sirens. I have watched this pattern through every major cycle. I watched people tell themselves that diversification alone would save them. I watched them cling to the idea that if they simply stayed calm and did nothing, they would be protected by some benevolent law of finance. Then the market fell, liquidity vanished, and the same people discovered a painful truth. Diversification is a decent umbrella in a rainstorm. It is not much use when the building catches fire. What protects you in a true economic break is not a pretty asset allocation pie chart. It is owning the things that become more valuable when everybody else is forced to sell. That is what the wealthiest people in the world understand. They do not treat a crash as a mystery. They treat it as a shopping event. That sentence sounds harsh, but harsh sentences are often the only honest ones in finance. Crashes are redistribution events. Ownership flows from the unprepared to the prepared, from the leveraged to the liquid, from the man who needs to sell this week to the man who spent the last 2 years making sure he would not have to. That is why I do not begin with what to buy during the crash. I begin with what the rich buy before it. The first thing they buy looks so boring that most people dismiss it. That dismissal is one of the reasons they stay ordinary. They buy short-term government paper, not because they are timid, because they understand ammunition. When I see somebody sitting on a mountain of treasury bills before a recession, I do not see fear. I see appetite with discipline. I see a hunter loading the rifle before daylight. People love mocking cash when markets are running higher. They say cash is dead money. They say cash is lazy. They say you are losing to inflation. The rich hear all of that and keep buying short duration paper anyway because they know something the crowd never learns. Cash is not only a return decision, it is an option on future chaos. That is one of the most important ideas in all of investing. Cash is not the opposite of investing. Cash is the right to invest later when the math is better. A man holding treasury bills into a crash is not missing opportunity. He is preserving the only universal purchasing tool on the board. When other assets get wounded, he can convert that paper into whatever he wants. Great businesses, real estate, distressed obligations, entire operating systems of commerce. He can buy them because he kept his purchasing power liquid while everyone else converted theirs into hope. That is why I call the first mechanism the liquidity weapon. It is a weapon because it does not merely defend you. It lets you go on offense when other people become involuntary sellers. Warren Buffett did not become Buffett because he loved excitement. He became Buffett because he understood optionality better than almost anybody alive. When he accumulated vast sums in T-bills and cash equivalents while the crowd kept demanding action, people called him conservative. What he was really doing was making sure that if the market handed him a genuine sale, he would be the only man in the room with enough dry powder and enough calm to use it. That is not conservatism in the timid sense. That is strategic hunger. Think about the arithmetic. If you hold a pile of short-term government paper while everybody else is sitting in overvalued equities, you are not merely protecting principal. You are protecting future bargaining power. If markets drop 40% or 50%, the investor who stayed fully loaded becomes emotionally injured and financially reduced at the exact same time. The investor who held liquidity may have earned less in the party, but he enters the hangover with full purchasing power. That difference is where fortunes are born. A crash requires sellers. Sellers require buyers. Buyers require cash. The rich understand the chain at a structural level. The middle class is usually introduced to it only after they have already become one of the sellers. Now, if the first asset is ammunition, the second is the legal doorway through which the rich step into ownership when public shareholders are being wiped out, distressed debt. Most people hear those two words and their eyes slide away. It sounds technical. It sounds like something happening in a room far above them and far away from ordinary life. In one sense it is. In another sense, it is one of the oldest wealth transfer devices in capitalism. A company gets into trouble, its stock collapses. The headlines begin writing the obituary. Retail owners talk about whether they should just hold and hope. Meanwhile, the people who understand the capital structure are not staring at the common stock. They are buying the debt. That is the second mechanism. I call it the creditor trapdoor, because that is exactly what it is. A hidden doorway beneath the public floor. When a company approaches bankruptcy, its bonds can trade at prices that imply doom 50 cents on the dollar. 30, 15, sometimes less. To the untrained eye, it looks like wreckage. To the sophisticated buyer, it can be something else entirely. A claim senior to equity, a claim on assets, a claim on future restructuring. A claim that may convert into ownership when the old shareholders are wiped out and the company emerges reborn. This is why the people who truly understand crises do not obsess over whether a company survives in its current form. They obsess over who owns the assets when the old form dies. That is a completely different question during every major downturn. Ordinary investors are taught to watch stock prices. The wealthy study the waterfall, who gets paid first, who gets reorganized, who gets pushed out, who comes out holding the new equity. That is how distressed debt works. You are not buying a dead bond for the coupon. You are buying a legal priority claim on future control. Howard Marks understood that better than almost anyone in modern finance. He built a giant empire around the idea that panic turns debt into an ownership instrument. When a business is priced as though it is already dead, but its assets, contracts, brands, or operating base still possess value, the debt becomes the bridge between fear and control. That is why distressed debt is so offensive in the best and worst sense of the word. It is not defense. It is not merely wealth preservation. It is a machine for acquiring productive assets from bankrupt structures at fractions of replacement value. And here is the ugly truth beneath it. Every distressed debt fortune is built on somebody else's dislocation. Employees lose jobs, shareholders are wiped out, local lenders get cornered, vendors become unsecured victims of a crisis they did not cause. Then a fund arrives with cash, legal sophistication, and patience. The fund buys the debt. The debt becomes the new equity. The assets survive. Ownership changes hands. A new fortune is made. The middle class is told that crashes are democratic pain. They are not. They are highly organized transfer events. That is why I want you to understand the principle, even if you never buy a distressed bond in your life. The principle is this. In a crash, legal priority beats narrative. Senior claims beat public hope. Structure beats sentiment. If you ever forget that, the market will teach it to you with unnecessary cruelty. The third asset is older than modern finance, older than stock tickers, older than central banks, and in some ways more honest than all of them, productive agricultural land, not land as a vanity item. Not land because some wealthy man likes the picture of himself as a country gentleman. I mean, land that feeds people, land with a caloric claim on the future. That is the third mechanism. I call it the caloric floor because everything else in capitalism is optional before food is. Human beings may postpone vacations, remodels, subscriptions, luxury handbags, software upgrades, and even car purchases. They do not postpone calories. They do not stop eating because the Fed moved rates or because a private equity fund blew itself apart. That is why productive farmland has a floor few other assets possess. It is not just dirt, it is biological necessity married to scarce acreage. When people talk about farmland as a safe asset, they usually say something shallow like, "They not making any more of it." That is true, but incomplete. The deeper truth is that productive farmland is tied to demand that remains stubbornly alive across currencies, governments, and market regimes. A piece of land that can produce food does not need Wall Street's approval to stay relevant. That matters in a world where paper claims can be diluted, over-leveraged, or politically destabilized. The greatest fortunes have always understood this at a primitive level. In Rome, when debt crises hit, the aristocracy did not respond by buying concept stocks. They accumulated land after plagues and wars in Europe. People with liquidity bought farms from families and estates that had lost the ability to carry them. In inflationary societies, hard productive land has again and again become the quiet refuge of people who want to claim on real output rather than nominal promises. Modern billionaires are not doing something new when they buy farmland. They are participating in one of the oldest patterns wealth ever discovered. Bill Gates did not become a major farmland owner because he woke up one day with a sentimental crush on agriculture. He understood that a system under monetary strain makes productive land more attractive, not less. A central bank can create dollars. It cannot create Iowa. That is the point. And for the intelligent investor, the lesson is broader than whether you personally can or should buy a farm. The lesson is that assets tied directly to necessity behave differently than assets tied to confidence. When confidence breaks, necessity remains. That is the floor. Now, in the modern world, the best form of this is not just any rural acreage. It is productive land linked to durable demand, efficient management, water access, and ideally exposure beyond a single local economic regime. I am not romantic about it. A farm is still an operating asset. Bad management can ruin it. Climate can hurt it. Politics can tax it, but at the most structural level, farmland remains one of the few assets whose usefulness survives monetary fashion. When the rich buy it before a downturn, they are not looking for a hot trade. They are buying a claim on future calories. There is nothing sentimental about that. The fourth asset is the one polite finance likes least to discuss because it reveals something embarrassing about how the upper tier really protects itself. Blue chip art and privately negotiated cultural assets. Now, before you dismiss this as absurd, let me explain what is actually going on. This has very little to do with taste and much more to do with scarcity. A great work by a dead artist is a permanently finite asset. No central bank can print another one. No recession can create more supply. No politician can vote to dilute its total outstanding inventory that matters. When the money supply becomes elastic and trust in financial assets begins fraying, scarce objects with social legitimacy start behaving like private vaults. Not public vaults, private vaults. That is the fourth mechanism. I call it the scarcity vault. Public markets are transparent. They are noisy. They are emotionally democratic. Everyone sees the price. Everyone sees the fall. Everyone can panic at once. Private cultural assets live in a different world. Deals happen in quieter rooms. Prices do not always surface publicly. Distressed sellers can negotiate directly. Families can convert one sort of wealth into another without stepping into the public crossfire. In times of monetary stress, the ability to move wealth into a scarce, culturally validated, low correlation object becomes extremely valuable to the very rich. And that low correlation feature matters enormously. When stocks are crashing and debt is repricing and public assets are being marked to market every second, a private treaty sale of a major artwork can happen on a completely different emotional clock. The asset is not necessarily soaring during the crisis. That is not the point. The point is that it is not mechanically chained to the same panic. That alone is a form of protection. Again, this is not mainly about art appreciation. It is about the rich preferring scarcity that cannot be printed, repriced every second, or easily seized by crowd psychology. Art becomes a legal and cultural vessel for preserving capital outside the public ticker. The middle class is usually excluded from this not just by money, but by access, relationships, opacity, and knowledge. That is one reason the pattern stays hidden. It does not announce itself with retail products. It moves through private channels. But the principle still matters for anyone paying attention. Scarcity plus legitimacy plus low forced correlation is a very powerful combination in periods of public market distress. The fifth asset is where protection ends and empire building begins. This is the most important one. The first four protect, store, preserve, or position. The fifth compounds, the fifth scales. The fifth is how new dynasties get built while everyone else is trying to recover what they lost. It is not glamorous at all. In fact, that is part of the reason it works. Essential service monopoly businesses, that is the fifth mechanism. I call it the necessity toll booth, because that is exactly what these businesses are. Toll booths on unavoidable human behavior, waste removal, storage, funeral services, pest control, medical waste disposal, water systems, boring, unlovable, often ignored businesses with one extraordinary quality. People cannot stop using them just because the economy turns ugly. Garbage still appears, people still die. Infestations still spread, water still needs treatment. Families still downsize and need storage. That is what makes these assets so powerful during and after a downturn. Their revenue does not depend on hope. It depends on life continuing. That sounds almost too simple, which is one reason the crowd misses it. The crowd likes glamour. Glamour makes people feel alive. Necessity just keeps collecting checks. But if you study the real fortunes built in and after downturns, you see the same pattern again and again. Sophisticated capital buys unglamorous cash machines after or during stress, because those cash machines can survive the shock, absorb distressed competitors, and emerge with more local pricing power than before. This is how monopolies and quasi-monopolies quietly get built. Not by inventing something sexy, by buying necessity when nobody else is emotionally capable of appreciating it. Wayne Huizenga understood that with waste collection, he was not selling fantasy. He was consolidating routes. Routes matter. If you own the route, the customer does not really have an infinite menu of alternatives. You are not in a beauty contest. You are in an inevitability business. That is the richest kind of business to own in a contraction. And because these businesses are usually ignored during boom times, they often avoid the speculative premium that infects glamorous sectors. They can be modestly valued in good times and dirt cheap in bad times, even though their underlying economics do not actually deteriorate in the same way as cyclical businesses. That is the secret. The rich do not simply buy what holds up in the crash. They buy what gets mispriced during the crash while still sitting on top of permanent demand. The necessity toll booth is one of the few assets that can do both. Now let me pull these 5 assets together because the full logic is much more important than the list itself. Short-term government paper is not just cash. It is purchasing power saved for the sale. Distressed debt is not just yield. It is the legal path from panic to ownership. Farmland is not just land. It is a caloric claim outside the monetary mood. Blue chip art is not just decoration. It is scarcity wrapped in legitimacy and opacity. Essential service monopoly businesses are not just boring companies. They are toll booths on human necessity and some of the finest engines for building new fortunes out of old panic. Do you see the pattern yet? Every one of these assets is tied to one of 3 conditions: liquidity, scarcity, necessity. That is the real playbook. Not some magical ability to guess the exact week of the crash. The rich do not need that. They do not have to ring a bell at the top. They just need to stand in the right places before everyone else starts running. That is why I say collapses are not random weather events for the wealthy. They are scheduled shopping events for people who understand what they want to own afterward. And this is the part that should unsettle you a little because it contains the moral center of the whole thing. The financial system does not merely reward patience. It rewards preparedness with asymmetry. The people who have liquidity when others lack it do not just avoid pain. They buy pain at a discount. The people who understand legal priority do not just invest. They inherit broken capital structures. The people who own necessity do not merely preserve wealth. They collect tolls while everyone else is discovering how fragile glamour really was. That is not a conspiracy. It is the operating logic of capitalism under stress. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Now, most people listening to this will not buy a Picasso in a private treaty room or take control of a distressed mall operator through the bond stack. Fine, that is not the point. The point is to understand the principles and translate them into your own scale. Can you hold real liquidity instead of forcing every dollar into overvalued risk assets because sitting in short duration paper feels too unproductive? Can you build exposure to boring necessity instead of endlessly paying up for glamour? Can you think about real productive assets rather than just financial abstractions? Can you stop treating every crash as a tragedy and start treating preparation for it as one of the few reliable ways ordinary people can meaningfully improve the trajectory of their financial lives? Those are the right questions. The wrong question is whether you are rich enough to do exactly what the ultra-wealthy do. That is the trap. Because if you ask only that question, you miss the whole lesson. The lesson is not vehicle specific. The lesson is behavioral and structural. The wealthy prepare long before the headlines tell them they should. They buy ammunition instead of stories. They buy priority instead of hope. They buy necessity instead of fashion. They buy scarcity instead of abundance. They buy toll booths instead of popularity. And when the crash arrives, they do not act shocked, they act. That is what I want you to understand, not how to sound like them, how to think like them, because in the end, every crisis asks the same question in a different voice. When assets are being dumped and dignity is leaving the tape, are you the seller or the buyer? The seller spent the prior 2 years maximizing feeling. The buyer spent the prior 2 years maximizing optionality. The seller believed permanent prosperity was normal. The buyer understood that panic eventually comes and that panic prices assets more honestly than euphoria ever will. The seller built a portfolio that required the world to remain kind. The buyer built one that expected the world to become cruel. And when cruelty arrived, the buyer was ready. That is the dividing line. Not intelligence alone, preparation. And here is the final truth. The market does not reward the man who reacts fastest to the crash headline. It rewards the man who prepared soon enough that the crash becomes a conversion event rather than a catastrophe. A conversion of liquidity into ownership. A conversion of patience into pricing power. A conversion of other people as forced selling into his long-term gain. That is how generational wealth is built. Not with better slogans, with better positioning. So here is the real choice. You can keep living inside the mainstream script that tells you crashes are random, preparation is futile, and the best you can do is hope diversification saves you. That script was designed to comfort people who are not expected to act. Or you can step into the harder truth. Crashes have shadows before they have headlines. The wealthy study those shadows. They move early. They buy the 5 things that become stronger when other people become weak. And when the doors open and the sale begins, they are not deciding what to do. They decided that months or years ago. They are simply collecting. That is the playbook. The only question left is whether you will keep admiring it from a distance or begin building your own version of it before the next shopping season arrives.